Hey, fourth graders, welcome to math class. As you'll see, we'll be talking about some decimals today. But before we begin, I want to start our math with a reading of Psalm 136, just the first three verses here. Now, I'm going to first start with the NIV, and then I'm going to change over and read the same three verses from the King James Version. See if you notice any differences. Okay, so this is the NIV, Psalm 136. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords. His love endures forever. Now, it probably sounds like a song that you might be familiar with, but here is the King James Version, the first three verses here. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endureth forever. Oh, give thanks unto the God of gods, for his mercy endureth forever. Oh, give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his mercy endureth forever. Now, if you noticed in the first passage, it said endures. His love endures forever. But in the King James version, it didn't say endures. It said endureth. Okay. The reason why I wanted to read that today is because that will come in handy when we talk about our decimals, believe it or not. Okay, so yes, this is a decimal right here. It does look like a dot. Remember when I was in fourth grade and I was learning about decimals, our teacher asked, does anyone know what this is called? It starts with a D, and my friend Matthew Northhouse said, it's a dot. And yes, it is a dot, but we do call it a decimal, okay? And I know at the beginning of the year, we did talk about our ones place value, our tens place value, and our hundreds place value. So if I were to have a number, let's see here, a number 6 in my ones place value, then that's just 6. But if I move that 6 over to the tens, all of a sudden it becomes 60, right? If I were to add a 0 to the ones, then it becomes 60. If I were to move that 6 all the way over to the 100s, it was 6, then it was 60, and now it is all of a sudden 600. Okay, now that's just a little review from what we talked about way back in September when we looked at place value at the beginning of the year. Now we're going to see what's on the other side of the decimal here, okay? So, yes, this is ones, tens, and 100s, okay? Now, if we look at this first place value over here, we're going to call that tenths. Now, notice it's tenths, kind of like endureth. Notice that we don't have a once place value. We just go straight to the tenths place value. Now, if I have, let's see if I can get this off the wall here. If I have my number 6, and it is on the other side of the wall, on the other side of the decimal, and I put it underneath my tenths place value, the way that I would read this as is 6 tenths. Okay, if I had a 2 instead of a 6 on my underneath my tenths, it would be read as 2 tenths. Okay, if I had a 6 in my ones place value, and I had a 2 in my tenths, the way that I would read it is 6 and 2 tenths. Okay, this decimal, the way that you read a decimal is just by saying the word and. I would say I have 6 and 2 tenths. Okay, so yes, we are looking at the tenths, but we also will be looking at the hundredths. Okay, so the hundredths go right next to the tenths. So in this case, if I have a 2 underneath the hundredths, I would just simply read that as 2 hundredths, okay? If I had a 6 underneath the hundredths, I would simply read that as 6 hundredths, okay? But now what if I have a number underneath my tenths and a number underneath my hundredths? Well, I'm going to add my 2 back up here, and I would read this as 26 hundredths, okay? If you have both the numbers here, well, if you have a number underneath the hundredths, you just ignore the tenths. Read this like you would read it any other number, 26, right? But then I would read it as 26 hundredths, okay? What if I were to flip these two numbers around here? If I were to put my 6 in my tenths spot and my 2 in my hundredth spot? Well, I would read the number just like any other number, and I would read it as 62 hundredths. Okay? But what if I have a 0 in my tenths spot here? Well, just like the last time, I would read it like any other number. This is 2 is the same thing as just a 2, so this would be 2 hundredths. Okay? But what if I had my 6 in my ones spot over here? Well, if you remember, when we read the decimal, we just read it as an and. So I would say 6 and 2 hundredths. Okay? What if I had, now that I have my tenths and my hundredths up here, what if I just had my 6 underneath the tenths? I don't have anything underneath the hundredths. I'm going to still stick a 0 up there. Well, this is tricky because it could be read a couple different ways, but there is a better way to read it. Okay. Now, before, when we had 2 digits underneath, one underneath the tenths and one underneath the hundredths, I would read this as 60, right? Or 26 or 62. In this case, the 0 is just a 0, right? So I can still just read this as 6 tenths. It could also be read as 60 hundredths. But the better way to read it is just 6 tenths. Okay? Similarly here, if I take my 6 away and I put a 2, the best way to read this would be 2 tenths. But the other way that you could read it is 20 hundredths. Those numbers are equal to each other. 2 tenths and 20 hundredths are equal to each other. Okay? So my biggest goal for you guys today is to be able to understand how to read these numbers here and where the tenths place value is and where the hundredths place value is in terms of our decimal. So remember that the tenths always goes right next to the decimal. There is no once place value right in between there. We just go from the decimal right to the tenths, and then right after the tenths is our hundredths. Okay. I do just really quickly want to show you guys what this will look like on a piece of paper or on the computer when they aren't spread out like this. So here I have my decimal, and then on the other side I have a 2 and a 6, and I still have them kind of lined up with my tenths and my hundredths here. Now notice my 2 is my digit closest to the decimal. It is the one right next to the decimal, in which case it must be the tenths. And my 6 is in my hundredths place value here. So I would read this as 26 hundredths. Okay, but if I were to change this here, I were to erase my 6 and I were to just have my 2, now notice my 2 is still in my tenths place value. I don't have anything in the hundredths, so I would just read this as 2 tenths. And again, just really quick, if I add a 0 here, right after the 2, my 2 is still in the tenths place value. I have a 0 in the hundredths, so again, this can be still read as 2 tenths, because I just added a 0, which is adding nothing really. But it can also be read as 20 hundredths. All right, so that will conclude our lesson for today. I know you have some problems to work on. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to go back and watch any part of this video again. But as always, remember to wash your hands.